Good evening, everyone. I'm Maria Lee, the lead of Creation Justice Commission of Malacca Johor Diocese. Creation Justice is a partner of Caritas, which is a social mission arm of the Catholic Church. Creation Justice focuses its mission on care of environment, our common home, in response to the call of Pope Francis letters Laudato Si Mi Signore and Laudate Deum. This year, the Creation Justice and Caritas collaborate with Malaysian Nature Society to support an important climate action of Jabatan Perhutanan Malaysia, that is mangrove restoration. There are two parts to this collaboration. Today is part one. This talk show today is aimed to raise awareness of the importance of mangrove ecosystem. And for part two, which will take place next month on 28th of July, where we celebrate World Nature Conservation Day. 55 of us from Malacca Johor Diocese is going for a mangrove restoration program, where we will be planting 450 saplings at Sungai Pulai Pontian. All right, so now I want to take this opportunity to thank Luke for this Catholic Go Live platform to host this talk show. And we are honored to have Belinda and Sean from Malaysian Nature Society here with us tonight. Now I'll pass the floor to Belinda, the Secretary of Malaysia Nature Society Johor Branch, to introduce Professor Sean, our invited speakers tonight.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Maria, and thank you, Luke. First of all, on behalf of the Malaysian Nature Society Johor Branch, I would like to express our deepest gratitude to Dr. Maria and the Creation Justice Commission of Malacca Johor Diocese for partnering with us on this very meaningful project. Okay, so we really appreciate your efforts in organizing this talk and also providing me with the honor of introducing our very distinguished speaker for tonight. So Dr. Sean Lam joined the Asian School of the Environment in January 2016. And after over 20 years as a lecturer at the National Institute of Education, following his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. A true islander, Sean was born in Tokyo, raised in Honolulu, Hawaii, and educated at Harvard University. He has dedicated his career in Singapore to teaching and research focusing on plant diversity, forest ecology, and conservation. Beyond academia, Dr. Sean Lam collaborates with the local environmental agencies and actively participates in nature conservation NGOs and civil society. He is the immediate past president of the Nature Society of Singapore and a valued committee member of the Malaysian Nature Society of the Johor Branch. And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Sean Kaikulani Yamauchi Lam. Sean, I hope I pronounce your name correctly. Over
like
to
a
you.
True islander, like a true islander. Belinda, thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure and an honor, what a privilege to be here this evening. I just want a very, very informal presentation, and I hope that we learn something about the mangroves in preparation for the very exciting work and very important work that you'll be doing shortly. Well, a month from now. So just again, I'd like to express my thanks to Luke and to Dr. Maria and to the Creation Justice Group and to Caritas Malaysia for giving us this opportunity, not only to work with you, but to present. This is just showing the Koala Slanger Nature Park, which is a very typical piece of coastal mangrove. So I'm going to just go through some of the distribution, a little bit of some key species of plants and animals from mangroves, as well as some of the challenges in conserving them, and how we as individuals and as organizations can do our part to make sure that these magnificent and very important ecosystems continue to thrive. And of course, all of this is in the context of sustainable development, which requires not only taking care of things like poverty, social and environmental justice, but it also includes nature conservation. And that, I think that links very well with what Dr. Maria was saying about creation care, and how it links really to Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si, which he published in 2015. So these are some of the things that I'd like to go through today. What are mangroves? What do they do for us? And what are some of the threats to them? In general, mangroves are distributed in the tropics. And you can see there's two major groups. One, Eastern and Western, but really more technically, it should be Atlantic and Eastern Pacific, and then Pacific for the other mangrove. The one that we're in the middle, of course, is the Indo-Pacific mangrove, which is much more diverse for some reason than the Caribbean mangrove. But there are similar characteristics. On the virtual screen behind me, you could see a very characteristic looking mangrove. There are some mangroves, though, that go out of the tropics well into the temperate zone. So if you can look at, say, South Africa, or even more so Australia, you can see that it's a mangrove that goes all the way down Victoria Strait to the Tasman Strait, as well as to the North Island of New Zealand, Aotearoa. And you can also see in the northern hemisphere, the furthest north they go is about southern Japan, near the island of Kyushu. So the typical tropical mangrove have about 30 species in our local mangroves. But at the northern extreme, and here you could see one, this is in Taiwan, in the Tamsui River, one species, and the mangrove is very short, maybe about 2.5 meters tall. So you can see at the extremes, the diversity drops and the size gets a lot smaller as well. Here's the distribution of mangroves in Malaysia, and you can see Sarawak and Sabah have a large percentage of the mangroves of Malaysia, but there's a sizable amount in the peninsula as well, particularly on the west coast, a lot less so on the east coast. In Johor itself, two major mangrove areas. On the left, you can see at the bottom right-hand corner of this image, that should be the Tanjung Piai National Park. And on the right, that's Pulau Kukup, one of the largest patches of mangroves in Malaysia. So right here in Johor. They also line rivers. So on the left, you see the Sungai Pulai, which is in the west of Johor. And then the photo on the right is the Johor River, the Sungai Johor. That's Pulau Tekong and Pulau Ubin, which are Singapore islands. And then sitting right in the mouth of the Johor River. And the dark green patches either side of the banks of the river would be or would have been mangrove in the past. But as you can see at the mouth of the Johor River, much of that mangrove you can see has been converted for industrial or sometimes agricultural use, which is typical for mangroves throughout the tropics. Mangroves are found, again, much of the west coast. This is a photo from Negeri Sembilan, and you can see here, for example, this is the Sungai Lukut, and again, a very typical oxbow kind of sinew, S-shaped bends in the river with mangroves all around that. And again, this is further north. And I think, if I remember correctly, Dr. Maria, you will be planting mangroves a little bit further north. So, these are some of the areas where mangroves do occur. Now, mangroves was done in the peninsula. This would have been during the colonial era, but this is a landmark 1928 paper by J.G. Watson, a forester who was a specialist in mangroves. So let me introduce you really briefly to these are some of my students, by the way, having fun in mangroves, as many students tend to do, but I'd like to introduce you to some of the diversity of mangroves. Now, mangrove trees first. So this little guide is available online. It was done by my colleague, Dr. John Yong, but I think there's even a better one that was done recently for Malaysia. This goes through all the different species. So Dr. Maria, I promise I'll send you a copy of this document done by Wetlands International to you as a way of preparing for your work next month. I'll just introduce you to a few of the key species. Some of the interesting ones, and they have cute names too. So the pisang, which is a back mangrove called Aegiceras. That's one of the really interesting and quite uncommon ones. But the most common one would be the one that you see here at the mouth of what's called Api pute or Avicennia alba. And of course, the classic mangrove species would be the bacao species, the ones with the great big stilt roots that are behind me in the virtual background. And they also have this peculiar, because mangroves, the challenges for plants is that the water is salty, the soil has very little oxygen, it's underwater most of the time. So it's a very challenging environment for the roots. And also the tides come in and out. So any seeds or fruits that land on the soil could be quickly washed away. So one of the adaptations is that many of these mangrove plants, they start to actually germinate while they're still on the tree, which is really fascinating. Here's a relative of the bacao. This would be called Bruguiera, the genus. I think I misspelled it as Brugui, and called Barus or bacao puti. And this is another relative. This is larger Bruguiera, Tumumera, also found in the middle zone of the mangrove. And how do they survive? Remember, I was saying that the mangroves, the soil is very poor in oxygen and they're underwater. So they have specialized structures on their roots or specialized roots to help them breathe or get air easily. And so, for example, these sticks that are sticking out, these are what are called breathing roots of the tree called Api or Avicennia. And these roots are very spongy, so they allow gas exchange very easily. On the bacao, with its stilt roots, there's a lot of fissures in that root that have spongy tissues again that facilitate gas exchange. So this is one way of coping with a very difficult, challenging habitat. This would be the roots of Bruguiera, and what this does not show quite clearly is that this root will go laterally, but they don't go horizontally. They every once in a while they go up and down what are called knee roots, and at the top of those little protuberances, those knees, again, there's spongy tissue which allows gas exchange. So very, very clever way of dealing with some of these challenges. Now, another very interesting thing, and this will be something to think about maybe when you do your restoration work, is that mangroves show very clear zonation. So from the mangroves furthest out, so on the right, which are subject to the early high tides and the last of the low tides, the lowest low tides. So they're underwater for much of the day, more than the ones at the back. There's a zone, what I call the front mangroves, and as you go further and further upstream, what I call the back mangrove. And not only do they differ in the amount of time that they're exposed, the water is saltier at the river mouth, of course, less salty at the further upstream. Now, Watson, in his work, he found that there was very clear zonation. So what these little lines and bands and circles are on this diagram are the different zones where he documented a particular sort of dominance of some mangrove species. So if you can see in this diagram, which was done by my colleague Dan Fries, based on a diagram from Watson's book, can you see it says Avicennia alba? So that's the Api pute at the most seaward margin of the mangrove. And there's another one called Sonaratia alba. That one is also mangrove that's found on the seaward side. And then as you go upstream, the mangrove species change. Now, Dan Fries did even more work. He was a professor at the National University of Singapore, but he's now in the US at Tulane University in New Orleans. And so he found that actually this zonation that Watson described really is a function of, you can measure the precise height relative to the tide. And this is what he found. And again, I'm happy to share these papers with all of you. Sonaratia alba, Avicennia alba are among the species that are found at the lowest level. So again, this is what's called surface elevation. And as you go higher and higher up, you have different species. So the implication for this is that when we do mangrove restoration, I guess being careful about planting which mangrove, the appropriate mangrove at the appropriate zone, based on the height of that, the surface elevation of that area should ensure the greatest success. I don't know if that makes any sense or not, but again, it's really a function of the surface elevation, which was a very nice insight of my colleague Dan Fries. I wouldn't call this trivia, but it's really interesting how place names are often named after trees. Now, in some cases, they're not named after mangroves. So in the case of, say, Pataling Jaya, PJ in Selangor, or Ipoh in Perak, the Ipoh is a rainforest tree, and so is the Pataling. Canostachys is Pataling, and Antiaris is the Ipoh. But there are some, and then Malacca is named after a gooseberry, Philanthus. But there is a town in Terengganu called Dungun, which is a back mangrove species. And there are actually quite a few places in Southeast Asia that bear the name of a mangrove species. So you can impress your friends with that one. There are, of course, some characteristic or charismatic species, some which are a bit far, like the estuarine crocodile, which is found in the rivers of Johor and also in Singapore these days. This is an interesting animal, the mud lobster, because what the mud lobster does is it feeds on organic material in the mud, but it takes this mud as it feeds and it pushes it to the surface, and it creates these sometimes as tall as 2-meter mounds in the mangrove, and it adds topography to the mangrove, which otherwise would be flat. And that topography allows other plants and animals to survive when they otherwise might not be able to live on the actual flat part of the mud flat. There are, of course, Belinda should be talking here because I'm no expert on birds, but some very characteristic mangrove species, such as the mangrove whistler, mangrove pitta, copper-throated sunbird, which its name is Kelichap bakau. So the people knew that these were birds of mangroves because the common name has bakau or rhizophora in them. Why they do not, why do they prefer mangroves and not other species? It's an interesting question. And here are some of the common sunbirds. And again, the crimson, copper, what used to be called olive back, but now it's got a new name, and there's copper-throated. That's the mangrove species, and it's beautiful. Here are a series of fish that are associated with mangroves, and those would, of course, be the mud skippers, ranging from the giant mud skipper to something much smaller, gill. Very interesting species. And again, there's another species in the mangrove, very iconic. This is the archer fish, and this is able to shoot jets of water to bring down its prey sitting up in the mangrove trees. Don't know if the video will play. No, let's. Long-tailed macaque, the common one yet, is not restricted to mangroves, but it is very common in mangroves. And in fact, it has the common name crab-eating macaque. And I guess that's for those that hang out here in the mangrove area. Not in the peninsula, but on Borneo, on some of these mangrove habitats, you might be lucky enough to see the proboscis monkey. Now, there are so many different mangrove species, whether they be shellfish and other mollusks, such as the mangrove oysters, this common stiput or telescope creeper shell. And I guess the other thing I want to add is that mangroves are part of a continuum. So, for example, typically when you go inland toward the coast, you go forest to a freshwater swamp to mangrove. And then once you're on the coast, mangrove to seagrass to coral. And so mangroves are not isolated ecosystems. They're linked to other habitats. And in order to, say, for example, if we wanted to take care of our reefs or seagrasses, we need to make sure that the mangroves were intact. Likewise, mangroves interact with ecosystems further upstream. So looking after one ecosystem in isolation on the coast might not be enough. It has to be, I suppose, an integrated way of managing and conserving these wonderful habitats. So what do we gain from mangroves? I mean, of course, they're beautiful and they're fun and interesting, but they provide lots of services of all kinds. So, for example, some things we get directly from mangroves, such as the bacao poles that can be used for construction work. I mean, they form the very standard scaffolding, which many of you might be familiar with. We see less and less of this, but you can still see. And they're also, again, used for general construction work. Straight, very solid timber mainly from rhizophyra or bacao. The bacao also makes some of the best charcoal, most sought after charcoal in the world. And again, this would be mainly the bacao or rhizophyra, sold from Malaysia and Indonesia and distributed all over the world, where there's a great demand for high quality charcoal wood. And again, this would be one of the traditional sources of revenue. I'm not going to enter a debate as to who invented the chili crab, but that again is largely the mangrove mud crab, Skyla, that is the source of chili crab. Of course, they're not sustainably harvested in many parts of the region. So that's another issue about sort of how do we sustainably use these wonderful ecosystems that provide and give life to us, and not only shellfish, but lots of fish. Some fish spend their entire lives in mangroves, many of them economically important, and other fish spend the juvenile phase in the mangrove. So either way, either as nursery grounds for fish and prawns, or as habitats in their own right for the adult fish, mangroves are extremely important and provide livelihoods for millions of people in Southeast Asia. And of course, there is the very fun for some and lucrative, very economically important business of recreational sport fishing, again, which mangroves then provide lots of money for local economies. So in so many different ways, the mangroves are indispensable to the livelihoods and the well-being of so many people in our region. Not, Southeast Asia in particular, but many parts of Malaysia as well in particular. So I cannot emphasize enough just how valuable these mangrove systems can be. Okay, so other services, and again, this is not trivial. This is very, very interesting and important. So mangroves provide other ecosystem services, such as carbon storage. So again, this has increasingly become important, the carbon storing ability, because there's a lot of organic material in mangrove mud, and the mangrove roots themselves are vast, they're extensive, and they have a large, what's called biomass. So they store lots and lots of carbon, because half of the weight of a tree is actually carbon. So you can imagine just how much carbon is stored, carbon that absorbs our industrial and other carbon emissions, carbon which, if not stored, would otherwise exacerbate global warming and cause other kinds of add to the climate crisis that we're experiencing, unfortunately. Now, mangroves have become so important that they specifically refer to the mangrove and seagrass carbon storage as blue carbon. And here are a series of slides I've taken from the World Bank. This explains something called blue carbon. Again, that's the carbon that's stored in mangroves and in seagrass systems. And they have become, in the past 5 years, this blue carbon has become extremely important to policymakers and to the finance sectors as they seek ways to store carbon and to create green finance markets that revolve around carbon storage. It's to really ecosystem conservation. Okay, so more on blue carbon from the World Bank. So again, that's the term point for CO2 stored in the world's coastal and marine ecosystems. And if you can see the economic value of mangrove ecosystems, from flood control, coastal protection, that alone prevents losses that could potentially be even many billions of dollars. So you get some idea of how important these systems are. Of course, me and Belinda and our other friends in the Nature Society love mangroves because they're fascinating, they're beautiful, and they have lots of interesting plants and animals. But I guess when you talk about other kinds of value to society, to humanity, it's really about kind of well-being in so many different ways: material, food, protection. These, again, I cannot emphasize how important these are. There has been the recent establishment of what's called the Blue Carbon Institute, at the international NGO called Conservation International. It's actually led by a Singaporean scientist named Dr. Siti Mariam Yaakob, who I had the privilege of watching develop into this great conservationist from the time she was a geography student in Form 6, Form 5 and 6. And again, this is from the Conservation International website. Just look at that, how much carbon can be stored in a mangrove forest. Now, what are some of the threats to mangroves? And there are many. They're challenging and they're not easy. Coastal areas are, of course, very accessible and are some of the first areas to be developed because they can be drained, reclaimed, and allow expansion of a lot of industry, housing, and so many other agriculture as well. Unsustainable use, the harvest of mangroves also contributes to their decline. Conversion to aquaculture, so say mangroves to prawn aquaculture is a huge issue, not just in Asia, but in Central America as well. And finally, rising seas that result from climate change are a major challenge. And I'll show you, there's a photo again. I showed this earlier. So if you look carefully on the left, so at the lower right-hand corner of that photo is Tanjung Piai. And then all that green belt along the coast, those are mangroves. But can you see there's a line, there's a straight line behind the mangroves. So in much of coastal Southeast Asia, certainly in the peninsula and in Singapore as well, behind them is a dike to keep the seas to limit their inundation. And as a result, the mangroves are basically a hard backstop, because they can't go beyond these coastal bunds. Now, currently, if the sea level maintains where it's at now, that's not an issue. But it does become an issue if sea level begins to rise, and then the mangroves would normally retreat to follow the tide levels. You remember the work from Dan Fries, which showed that mangroves find their appropriate surface elevation. And surface elevation will change as the waters begin to rise higher and higher. So what should happen is the coast should retreat, should gobble up land and move further inland, and the mangroves would move with it. But with a hard barrier, the mangroves can only retreat so far, before which they are unable to keep pace with the rising seas. Research done by Singapore's Earth Observatory have shown that if sea levels begin to rise at a rapid rate, mangroves will not be able to track that sea level rise, and essentially they will drown. So there may need to be some very active measures in parts of Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, to actually ensure that mangroves, especially in areas where people are found, live, will be able to thrive. This is a paper done in 2015. This documented the loss of mangrove in the Iskandar Johor development, and there was a net loss of 6,000 hectares of mangrove. Again, this is perhaps inevitable with development, but then the question is how much mangrove loss can be sustained before they start to lose the ability to provide many of the services, such as carbon storage, providing habitats for fish, and so on. And that's ongoing work. I think it's important. It's important, and the natural resilience of mangroves gives one hope. But then if you look at, for example, the amount of mangrove loss to aquaculture, just look at some of these figures. This is from India, Indonesia, Ecuador, sometimes in the range of 30-40%. Thailand, in the Andaman Sea, 40%. In some estuaries, 20%, with annual loss of maybe 0.5%, 1%, and in some extreme cases, 2% to 3% a year in certain parts of the Indo-Pacific. Very worrying indeed. Again, this is just a little graphic that shows some of the areas where mangroves have been lost. So there's work to be done, but I remain hopeful. And as long as there are people like all of you who support Caritas' efforts, stand up for creation justice and the protection of nature, I think these ecosystems do have a chance, because mangroves are resilient. This is in specifically, I put these slides back in to specifically relate back to the restoration effort that you will all be doing. So if you take a look at this, this is an article from Mangroves, the online environmental journal. If you look at these mangroves, they're all one species of bacao, the rhizophora. They're easy to plant because you take the mangrove plant and which is like a stick, and you just poke it into the mud. It's very easy to do, and I guess it's secure. But the challenge there is, are these planted at the right surface elevation? So meaning, is it too far up or too far down the mangrove? Is it outside the comfort zone? If it's not, and these mangroves could thrive, then of course that's very good. But studies have shown that many of these mangrove restoration efforts, sometimes the wrong species is used in the wrong place, and so I think this is a chance for, say, Malaysian Nature Society to work very closely with you to make sure that we're kind of doing the not only ecologically right thing, but in terms of this plant survival and the thriving ability of that regenerative mangrove to thrive. We're doing the right thing. Again, you can see here, right? This is in Central Java. That's all bacao, because that's a very easy and convenient and hardy plant. But again, getting the surface level matched up is critical. Now, M&S, my colleagues at Malaysian Nature Society do quite a lot of mangrove work besides working with Caritas Malaysia. So let me just, I just wanted to say, this is in Kuku. So here's a kampong right on the water. Now, if the conditions are right, the mangroves will come back on their own. So you can see these are young mangroves just starting to recolonize this mudflat. So that shows the resilience of the mangroves. And so we just need to make sure, right, when we plant mangroves, just have a lookout, because if the conditions are right, there should be a little bit of natural regeneration to begin with. And we just want to augment that. So these are just some of the Malaysian Nature Society's education centers, such as this one is in the Cameron Highlands, but the Eco Care Center in Terengganu is near a mangrove area, as is the iconic Kuala Selangor Nature Park, which is a very important mangrove conservation site on the west coast. And there's Kuala Selangor seen from the air. There's some restoration work being done currently within the Kuala Selangor Nature Park as well. But you can see, right, the town of Kuala Selangor has been carved out of what used to be mangroves, because it's either side of the Selangor River. So this is very typical for Southeast Asia, where much of the mangroves have been reclaimed and drained. So again, some of the work that was done a few years ago at Kuala Selangor, a lot of restoration efforts, and we are so happy that we have this opportunity to work with Caritas Malaysia to continue this care and conservation of mangroves. So I just want to add that some of the best managed mangroves are in Malaysia. So if you go north to Perak, an area called the Matang Mangroves, this is the longest running sustainably harvested mangrove in the world, approaching 100 years of bacao harvesting. So lots to be proud of it in Malaysia. There's the Matang Mangrove once again. The last few slides, I just wanted to say, I think there are a few what I call miracles of nature. So one could be, for example, coral spawning, the annual coral spawning. Another one could be the fruiting every once in a while of the Meranti or dipterocarp trees. Those are two of the three miracles of nature in the region. Another one is the raptor migration, movement of the birds from Sumatra to Tanjung Tuan near Port Dickson. And a mangrove specific miracle of nature really are the synchronous fireflies that are found up in the back mangroves of many of our large rivers, such as the Johor River, the Selangor River. So the you must see this. This would, I didn't know words to describe just how beautiful, magical, miraculous, and wondrous this is. And again, it's all in keeping with the Holy Father, Pope Francis himself has written and spoken about so eloquently and powerfully, that Laudato Si is not just about nature, but it's really nature and people. The call of the earth and the call of the poor are interlinked. Looking after one requires looking after the other. And I think what that you all are all doing in the care of these mangrove habitats is so important, so valuable, And so in keeping with the great work that's being done around the world by people like you who care about and are prepared to take action to look after the creation. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions now.
Thank you, Prof. Sean, for enlightening us with all the services of mangrove. I have learned that not only the trees in mangrove that has provided us with material for our daily use like construction and also charcoal, right? Charcoal is also from mangrove, yeah? And the habitat that is growing along with mangrove is also providing us with lots of seafood. I'm mouth-watering when I see your chili crab, yeah? And yeah, and also that Prof actually show us that these are what we can see, but the services is beyond that, that is actually taking care of the carbon that we are spewing out so much. And so this blue carbon, absorbing all the carbon dioxide that we are so carelessly produce as a greenhouse gas. And so it is a very important thing that we need to conserve it so that it can help us to cater with these greenhouse gases. And it also protect our coastline from erosion and flood and also the storms. So this is what I have learned from you, Prof. Little did I know that there is this zoning of this mangrove. And so the correct plant, I hope we are planting. And that's why I think it's very important that we are going along with the perhutanan people, the Jabatan Perhutanan. Hopefully they're giving us the correct species of sapling. They should know what is the correct zone that we should be planting. I have a question here, Sean, Prof, that apart from us as a commoner, planting, replanting, or supporting the mangrove restoration by the forestry department, is there anything else that we can do?
Yes, that's a very good question, and it's always a difficult one because you think each of us, what can we do? We're so small, and these problems are so large. I think you can support both, again, individually as well as collectively the work that's being done by a lot of groups such as, say, the Malaysian Nature Society. Join as a member, support the work, because they are trying to engage local authorities, not necessarily to say stop development altogether, but it's to sort of sequence development in a way that allows these ecosystems to continue to thrive. And it's really to then also, by supporting groups, or either again through the work of Caritas, shifting public opinion so that they realize that people's well-being is linked very much to the well-being of nature is very important. So we might get short-term goals, say converting, say, mangrove into aquaculture or industrial use. But what happens is once we clear that mangrove, we may lose some of the protective and other functions that they provide. And in the end, everybody suffers. So I think that through that kind of sharing this, the information, the outreach, also, of course, we get a lot of, make sure that maybe some of the food that we get from the mangroves are sustainably harvested and managed so that there's good stewardship over these resources. And I think that that's another thing that's very important to all of us, which is we've been blessed with these very productive and miraculous, really, ecosystems that give life to all of us. How can we be good stewards? And we can be good stewards, again, in a direct way, whether they're through consumers, good stewards through the kind of good restoration work that you're doing, and good stewards just by kind of, as I mentioned earlier, informing our fellow citizens about just how important they are. And oftentimes it's not that people don't like nature, it's just that maybe the public opinion isn't quite where it could be.
Yeah, is there any questions on the YouTube side, Luke, that we can see?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sean, for this very fruitful. I think we also learned a lot of new things about mangrove today. I think there is one comment on the YouTube saying that doing mangrove cleanup, it is really an important task that we need to do nowadays to keep these plants alive and also to protect the environment.
Oh my gosh, Luke, you're so right when we talk about, because mangroves, all those roots, they're so good at trapping garbage, isn't it? That
Garbage.
floats in on the tides. It's almost kind of, demoralizing to see how much gets trapped in those mangroves. And of course, we could clean them and we need to, keep them healthy. But I guess that also shows, how in the world of environment, you have people like Belinda who protect the birds and the trees and everything. Me too. And then there's people who maybe the trash and minimizing, resource use, but they're so linked. You really need to integrate these. And I think it's groups such as Caritas, which have kind of they deal with that whole spectrum of environmental and justice that can address these with the level of kind of a holistic approach that really is so necessary. So I'm very happy that you brought that point up.
Yeah, while waiting for other people to ask questions, I have one more question. What are the challenges that you foresee we might be facing in our area here in Malaysia and Singapore in this restoration work?
Okay, very good question, Dr. Maria. So there is, of course, the actual restoration that we can do right now, which is to take these ecosystems that have been degraded a little bit, but I think another agencies see the opportunity to restore them. So doing that in the most ecologically appropriate way, it can be done. There's science to it, and I know with the right support and funding, it can be accomplished. The longer term challenge would be with rising sea levels. If sea level rise can be limited and at a rate that allows the mangroves to keep pace with that rising sea, I think the mangrove ecosystems will be fine. The worry is if the sea levels start to rise very quickly, what happens is the mangroves will have no place to go because they're going to run into, in some places, developed areas. And so it might need some very clever kind of engineering work along the coastal areas, maybe to create even perhaps artificially somehow or through some clever combination of ecology and engineering to allow these little pockets of mangroves to thrive in future. So it's going to really require the best minds and the most passionate individuals in our countries to allow these precious habitats to continue so that our children and grandchildren will be able to enjoy them and the benefits that they bring, just as we have been so blessed to benefit from them.
Sean, I have a question. Can you share any example of a successful mangrove restoration project anywhere in the world, or even Malaysia or Singapore?
Yes, so thank you, Belinda. I have seen. There are many mangrove projects. Some again fail because of maybe mismatch between the species and where they're planted. But the best, there's been some very good projects in Sulawesi. Again, if you recall the name, Dan Fries, he has consulted a lot of these projects where they really try to carefully match the surface level and the tides with the appropriate species. So they've been able to do a few good ones in Sulawesi. I know that there's a small demonstration project on Pulau Ubin in Singapore. There's the Pulau Semakau, which is an area off the southern coast of Singapore. Again, that was a very intensive, high density mangrove planting, maybe a little bit, some people say too high, but I think it was a successful attempt. So again, it's more the preparation is as important as the work itself. And what I can do is I can send to you and to Dr. Maria maybe a catalog of some projects that were done very well and why they are believed to have been particularly successful.
Yeah, I think there is a question. In fact, there are some questions on the YouTube. I think we have KH Chong is asking, how can we encourage more people to get their hands and legs muddy to appreciate mangrove as compared to going places like shopping malls, which is more attractive? How can we get people to appreciate mangrove much better?
That's a very good question, isn't it? And some people, of course, find the mangroves.
Yeah.
The fragrance is a little bit maybe outside of what we're used to, or just texture. But I think so. There's a couple of some people maybe can go from 0 to 100, like not shopping mall to mangrove straight. no problem, and find that that's a really enlightening and cathartic and life-changing experience. And I don't mean that as a joke. I mean, some people I think are truly moved. It's such a different sensation to be in that muddy habitat. For others, I think, starting out simple, like even something like gardening on your balcony or working in a community garden, basically just the idea of getting out, breathing fresh air, being in the sunshine, touching soil, even in the most humble way, then we gradually get used to it, begin to not only get used to it, but begin to enjoy the experience. And then, so some people might require a gradual transition, but again, something simple as gardening, growing some seeds and watching them grow, just that connection with nature in the simplest possible way can prepare us for doing, some incredibly difficult and challenging nature restoration work. But by the time you get there, it's not going to be that challenging. It'll be fun and enjoyable. People will be surprised.
Yeah, I think it is also a matter of experience. Once they get into it, I think they will love it very much. There's another question brought up by our audience. With the recent oil spill in Singapore that we know of, it must have affected the mangrove trees. So are there any example elsewhere to show that the resilience of mangrove in overcoming this kind of threats?
Okay, that's a really good question. Luke, thank you for sending that in, Alan.
Yeah.
I have looked at some of the literature on this, and I think in terms of, like, say, coral or seagrass, in places where the coral and seagrass are healthy, they're found below the lowest low tide. So in other words, oftentimes those habitats might not come into direct contact with the worst of the oil spill if you clean it up quickly enough. Of course, some oil will drop down and cover some of the coral, but oftentimes they're saved by the fact that they don't necessarily come completely into contact with oil. But mangroves, if the oil spill is bad enough that the mangrove roots come into contact with oil, they apparently can suffer quite badly. And of all these coastal habitats, the research seems to suggest that the mangroves are often the most vulnerable. So luckily, this particular spill in Singapore that happened recently was not a huge, it was on the scale of how big these can be. This was thankfully on the smaller side. But what I think it might have done is it will prepare a response plan, which might maybe, for example, find the most critical or most diverse mangroves and very quickly try to protect those. So to kind of prioritize what would be kind of the core areas. And if those core areas can be protected, then the mangrove seeds can go out from there and begin to repopulate the areas that have been more heavily impacted. So mangroves are resilient up to a point. Unfortunately, they can be a bit sensitive, so that requires really good preparation. And luckily, we managed to dodge the worst effects on this particular spill. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sean, and also all the questions posted by our audience tonight. I think Dr. Maria has a good activity upcoming that the Diocese of Malacca Johor is doing. Maybe we can hear from Doctor on this meaningful event.
Oh, all right. So on the 28th of July, we will be going for outing to plant mangrove. And we have fully subscribed. One bus will be going and with a bit oversubscribed. So we have 55 people that is going, and one bus with 2 private vehicles will be going to Sungai Pulai, Pontian, where we will be planting 450 saplings. And these saplings are sponsored by many people. Our Bishop has sponsored 200 saplings. We had to pay for the saplings actually, 50 ringgit per saplings, and so 250 are actually supported by Bishop, and also we have a large number of people from especially Plantong, St. Joseph Plantong Church that actually has come out with some funding to actually support this payment for the saplings and other expenses like the services from the perhutanan and things like that. So thank you. Take this opportunity to thank you all the sponsors who have sponsored these saplings for us to do this restoration work. And I thank Malaysian Nature Society for linking us with the perhutanan people to allow us to plant the right species of mangrove so that it will thrive. So it's not so easy for us to simply go and find sapling and then just plant, and you may not survive because this may not be the correct zoning. Yeah. That's what the importance of getting the right people to guide us. And thank you very much from both of you from Malaysian Nature Society.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you once again and have a good night. See you. Bye-bye.